In Dungeons & Dragons, a PC is a player character and a DMPC is a Dungeon Master's player character. There's a lot of debate around whether DMPCs should be used at all, but today I want to tell you about how I, as a DM, was kind of forced into keeping a DMPC around and how that actually turned out to be a pretty good thing. Hey, welcome to Rogue's Roll Call. My name is Cam. Thank you so much for tuning in. I make videos about D&D, so if that's your kind of thing, I would love it if you stuck around. I want to talk to you about DMPCs, and I would love to hear from you in the comments where you land on them. Do you think that they should be completely forbidden, outlawed? Or maybe, do you think that they're great? Do you think that they're actually a really good tool for DMs to use? Or do you land somewhere in the middle? So during the last campaign that I was DMing with some of my mates as the players, they reached a point where they needed to track down a traveling mercenary to get some information about an orc necromancer that was important to our ranger's backstory. They eventually managed to find the mercenary and were surprised to find that he was an undead man named Reich, a sellsword who wears a cloak that lets him disguise his face and has a fondness for baked goods. Reich joined them for a small fee to help in continuing that ranger's backstory, and to be honest, that was meant to be it. I originally planned for Reich to kind of divert off after the job was done. He was a mercenary, he was getting paid to help them with this one thing, that would be it. But, to my surprise, after the job was done, the players actually ended up paying a fair bit of money out of their own pockets just to keep him around. I was surprised because I felt like having Reich stay with them any longer would take him out of the territory of being an NPC and into the territory of being a DMPC, and that was something that I had been told that players generally hate. But Reich stuck around and the players began asking about his past, so all of a sudden I was essentially forced to create a pretty in-depth backstory for this random NPC. To keep it short, Reich was a fisherman who lived over a century ago before being killed when a group of orcs raided his village. One of those orcs was a necromancer who raised their victims as puppets to continue their conquest along the Sword Coast. Reich got his freedom when one of that necromancer's students took pity on him and released him from the control. Fast forwarding to our campaign, the history that I just mentioned gives Reich the motivation to make up for all of the evil things that he did while he was under that necromancer's control. Additionally, another one of that necromancer's students ended up being the big bad of that ranger's backstory. One of my player's character, the ranger, had a whole backstory kind of side quest chain, and the big bad from Reich's past tied in with the big bad of that ranger's backstory. While I normally don't like to plan deaths, even for NPCs in the campaigns that I plan, I did plan for Reich to perish in the fight with this big bad. The necromancer was meant to gain control of Reich and make him fight the players who would be forced to kill him in self-defense. Imagine my surprise when the players not only refused to fight Reich, but through some great risk to themselves and through some really clever gameplay, they actually managed to save him from the necromancer's control. Despite my plans, Reich was alive, kind of alive, and apparently here to stay. So it's about a year later at this point, and we're in a whole new campaign now. But my DMPC is still in the game. Not because I've been protecting him by any means, but because my players have been bending over backwards just to keep him around. I have to admit, from a DM and from the point of view of the person who created this NPC, it has been pretty heartwarming to see them become so protective of this character. But I did make it explicitly clear to my players that they do not have to keep Reich around for my sake, to spare my feelings. I made that very clear, but every time he was knocked out during combat or caught in a trap, my mates would do whatever they can to save him. This NPC, like Reich, was as much a part of their group as any of the other players around the table. I do think that there are very, very good reasons for avoiding DMPCs in your game, and we'll get to that in the very next section, but I just wanted to tell you about my experience with using an NPC that tags along with the group for a very long period of time. And specifically, I also want to tell you how I made that DMPC work without getting in the way of my players' characters. So like I said, there are very good reasons that people will tell you to never use DMPCs, and even though I have kind of technically done it myself, I don't really disagree with the majority of it, but I do think for the most part it comes down to how your players play and how your DM DMs. Some players, like the players at my table, will be a lot more receptive to an NPC that kind of tags along and takes up even a tiny bit of that spotlight. Other players will not be okay with that, so it's kind of up to the DM to gauge whether it's going to work or not. The main problem with DMPCs is that in some cases they'll be added by the DM whether the players like it or not. Unfortunately, some DMs want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to run the game and be the DM and be the one essentially in charge, but they also want to be a player, which unfortunately is a red flag bigger than Megan Thee Stallion's dump truck. Especially if you have a game that already has like 5 or more players, I would agree that having a DMPC added to that party could be more of a detriment than a boon. At that point, what you're doing is spreading the choice economy very thin, and you're also making combat take a lot longer than it really needs to. Some of the horror stories that I've heard regarding DMPCs almost always involve a DM who, adds their own badass character to the mix, and then starts using that character to play the role of the main character. The DMPC will make all of the choices for the party. They'll have the coolest story and character moments. They will be nearly untouchable during combat. I've even heard of cases where a DM will add a DMPC, then make the bulk of the campaign focus around that DMPC's backstory. It is my strong belief that a DMPC should never be as important as the player characters. I will talk more about that in the next section, but I believe that DMPCs should be bordering on being like a sidekick for the party. Now, some people would say that what I just described right there was in fact not a DMPC, but rather just a companion NPC. And you know what? While I think that we might be splitting hairs a bit when it comes to talking about an NPC that's sticking around with the party for a very long time, I also don't completely disagree with you. So, going off that logic, let's talk about how I personally have made Reich more of a companion NPC rather than a DMPC. To be very clear, I am not a D&D expert. I'm not claiming that my DMPC worked because I'm just so good at DMing. I'm far from it, trust me. If there's more than like 3 conditions going around during a combat encounter, I start to panic. But I am going to give you some of the main tips that I've found to be super helpful while having a companion NPC in my game. Number 1, have the NPC be employed in some form by the players. You don't have to do this. Introducing the NPC character as a sellsword or a mercenary or a guide isn't completely necessary, but it is really helpful in the fact that it will give a lot of that choice agency back to the players. I, as the DM, am still controlling that character, I'm still playing that character, but if one of my players says, hey Reich, would you mind keeping a lookout while we sneak into this dungeon, my NPC is still doing something useful, but it was the player's choice. And they don't have to convince him to do it, and it feels natural for them to be giving him orders because he's a sellsword. They're paying him. Kind of as a side note to this point as well, I think it's important to make it your player's choice to keep the NPC around. Maybe for the sake of the story, you need an NPC to travel with the party for a bit. That's completely fine, but after a while, I think it should be the player's choice whether that NPC stays with them or not. Forcing an NPC companion on your players might be necessary on rare occasions, but certainly not indefinitely or for long stretches of time. Number 2, tie your NPC in with one of the player characters' backstories. I really love this tip because it makes the NPC so much more interesting to the players in a way that makes them feel directly involved. Reich could have just been some random mercenary with a somewhat mysterious past, but when that ranger in my group, that player who plays a ranger, when he found out that this undead sellsword that they've been having traveling with them for a while was actually tied to the big bad of his backstory, the orc necromancer that he had been hunting since well before he even met Reich, it blew his mind. I've just personally found that having the NPC be important to one or more of your players' personal stories, the stories that those players have created for themselves, is a really great way to make that NPC more interesting, more compelling, more important, but most importantly, importantly, without overshadowing the players. You know, it's not like the DMPCs we talked about before, where they have this big badass backstory that the players are forced into investigating. A backstory that serves no purpose other than to stroke the DM's ego and diverts attention away from the actual players at the table. It doesn't do that, it does the opposite. This NPC's backstory is also the player's backstory. It enhances it. Number 3, important choices should never fall to the NPC. This point speaks for itself, so I won't harp on it, but yeah, really big decisions that have a big impact on the story or the direction of the story should always fall to the players. Decisions like, you know, should we fight this big group of golems, or do we spare or slay the traitorous blacksmith, should never be the DM's call. I would also add that when a lot of dialogue is happening, let the NPC sit back and just kind of listen, unless one of the players speaks to them directly. Especially if the players are having a dialogue with another NPC. The DMPC doesn't have to be completely silent, of course, but again, it all just comes down to leaving as much of that choice agency as you can in the player's hands. Number 4, give the players opportunities to lose the NPC without punishment. This is a really important one. Of course, don't give the NPC plot armor. They should be just as at risk of death as any of the players in the story. I would argue maybe even more at risk. Something I made sure to do with Reich multiple times was let my players know in the story that they could lose this NPC any time that they want, and there wouldn't be any serious consequences for it. They wouldn't be punished, whether that be through death or just ending their contract with this mercenary and sending him on his way. Sometimes, before the party would set out on a large travel section of the game, Reich would ask if they wanted him to come with them or stay back and gather intelligence. That way, the players could benefit from both, from having him there or not. If they have the NPC come with them, they have an extra blade during combat. If he stays back, they might have access to more information that will help with the story. No punishment. And yet, to my surprise, they always dragged Reich along. I wish I could say I'm disappointed by it, but I'm not. To be completely honest, I think it's really cute how much these players have come to care about this silly zombie NPC man that I invented to be around for like 2 sessions or so a year ago. Anyway, in the campaign we're in now, bit of a spoiler alert, but I think time for Reich is almost up, sadly. I won't get too into it because it's a long story, but basically Reich has contracted a special kind of plague that can't be cured in any easy way due to him being undead. A lot of the cures for this plague are things that would immediately kill the undead. And I think all of the players and myself know that we're near the end of Reich's story. We're reaching a point where it makes sense for him to kind of be done with, you know? It's really bittersweet, but I've loved every second of watching my players interact with this NPC or DMPC if you like. I got to feel like part of the party without getting in their way. I'll miss Reich, and based off my mates' reactions when I did the reveal of his plague, it seems like they'll miss him as well. What do you think about DMPCs? I would love to hear your thoughts, or even better, your experiences. Have you played in or have you been a DM for a game where a DMPC was there and it went horribly, or maybe it went really well? Thanks so much for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. I really appreciate it. The channel is relatively new, but I will be making plenty more videos about D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, doing video essay kind of stuff, discussions on trending topics within D&D, all that kind of fun stuff. So if you love D&D as much as I do, I would love it if you stuck around. That'll just about do it, but tell you what, tell your DM that I said you can roll with advantage. Have a good one. Catch ya.